The day I saw my husband and my best friend together, I thought my life was over. I believed they were having an affair. I wish that was all it was. Because what I discovered next was something I never expected, and it changed everything I thought I knew about both of them. Let me start from the beginning because you need to understand how perfect everything seemed before it all fell apart. My name is Sarah, and for 7 years, I had what I thought was a solid marriage. My husband Marcus was the kind of man who remembered anniversaries, who still kissed me goodbye every morning, who told me he loved me without me having to ask. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We had dreams, plans, a future we were building together, brick by brick. And then there was Jessica, my best friend of 15 years. We met in college, survived terrible roommates together, cried through breakups, celebrated promotions, stood beside each other at our weddings. She wasn't just my best friend. She was my sister in every way that mattered. The kind of person who knew my coffee order, who could finish my sentences, who I trusted with every secret I'd ever had. Marcus and Jessica got along beautifully. Maybe too beautifully, but I never thought anything of it back then. Why would I? Jessica came to our family gatherings, helped Marcus surprise me on my birthday, gave him advice when he was struggling with his business decisions. When Marcus started his consulting firm 3 years into our marriage, Jessica was one of his biggest cheerleaders. She believed in him. We both did. Our life looked stable and happy from the outside, and honestly, it felt that way on the inside too. Sunday brunches, movie nights, business dinners where Jessica would join us and would laugh until our sides hurt. I had everything I thought I wanted: a husband who adored me, a best friend who had my back, security, love, trust. I trusted them both completely. That's what made everything that came next so devastating. It started small, little things I told myself I was imagining. Jessica started visiting more often when I wasn't home. She'd call Marcus directly instead of me. At first, I thought nothing of it. They were friends too, right? But then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I came home early from work, Jessica's car would be in our driveway. She'd be sitting at our kitchen table with Marcus, and the moment I walked in, they'd both go quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people who were just hanging out. The guilty quiet of people who had just stopped talking about something they didn't want me to hear. Marcus became secretive in ways he'd never been before. His phone, which used to sit casually on the counter, was suddenly always in his pocket, always face down, always just out of reach. Phone calls would stop mid sentence when I entered a room. He'd step outside to talk, lowering his voice like he was handling classified information. When I asked him about it, he'd smile, that same warm smile, and tell me it was just work stuff, boring business calls, nothing I needed to worry about. But I was worrying. How could I not? Jessica started acting strange too. She'd avoid eye contact when we talked. She'd change the subject whenever I mentioned Marcus. One time, I caught her staring at me during lunch with this look of pure guilt on her face, like she was carrying a secret that was eating her alive. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said she was stressed about work. But I knew Jessica. I'd known her for 15 years, and she was lying to me. The worst part was how Marcus defended her. If I even hinted that Jessica had been acting weird, he jumped to her defense immediately, too quickly, too intensely, like he needed to protect her from my suspicions, like her reputation mattered more than my peace of mind. Something didn't feel right, but I never imagined the truth. Then the financial stress started. Marcus had always handled our money. He was good at it, responsible, careful. but suddenly we were cutting back. He said the business was having problems, that a few clients had pulled out, that we needed to be more conservative with our spending. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? But then the conversations became more urgent. He started talking about taking out loans, about restructuring debt, about making sacrifices. When I tried to look at our accounts, he got defensive. He said I was stressing him out, that he had it under control, that I needed to trust him. Trust him. The man who was suddenly keeping secrets. The man who was constantly on the phone with my best friend. The man who flinched every time I asked a direct question. Late night messages started appearing on his phone. I saw Jessica's name flash across the screen at 11 at night, midnight, 2 in the morning. When I asked about it, Marcus would grab his phone and delete the messages right in front of me, not even trying to hide it, just deleting the evidence and telling me it was nothing. Jessica stopped calling me altogether. She'd cancel plans at the last minute. She'd make excuses about being busy, about work being crazy, about needing space. My best friend of 15 years was avoiding me, and my husband was defending her silence like his life depended on it. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that something was wrong, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my insecurities get the better of me, that I needed to trust the two people I loved most in the world. Then, one day, everything changed. I came home early from a doctor's appointment. I wasn't feeling well, and I just wanted to lie down, maybe watch some mindless television, and forget about the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. But when I pulled into our driveway, Jessica's car was there. Again. And this time, something inside me snapped. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car and I watched. I watched Marcus come out of our house with a folder in his hands. I watched Jessica meet him on the front porch. I watched them talk in hushed, urgent tones, and then I watched my husband pull my best friend into a long, emotional hug. The kind of hug you give someone you care about deeply. The kind of hug that broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. They didn't see me. They were too absorbed in whatever they were discussing, too focused on each other. When they finally separated, Marcus looked serious, tense, like he was carrying the weight of the world. Jessica looked like she was about to cry. I waited until she drove away. Then I waited until Marcus went back inside. And then I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, trying to figure out what I was going to say, trying to prepare myself for the conversation that was about to destroy my marriage. When I finally walked through that door, I didn't even let him speak. I confronted him immediately. I told him I saw them. I told him I knew something was going on. I demanded the truth. Marcus went pale. He looked at me like I just punched him in the stomach. He tried to speak, but I wouldn't let him. I called Jessica. Right there, on speakerphone, with Marcus standing 3 feet away from me. When she answered, I could hear the fear in her voice. I asked her directly, "Are you having an affair with my husband?" The silence on the other end of that call felt like it lasted a lifetime. And then Jessica said the words that I thought would confirm my worst nightmare. "Sarah, it's not what you think." Not what I think. The most cliche, guilty phrase in the history of confrontations. I didn't want to hear explanations. I didn't want to hear excuses. I wanted the truth, and I wanted it immediately. Marcus tried to take the phone from me, but I pulled away. Jessica was crying now, actually crying, and she kept saying the same thing over and over. "Please, Sarah, you have to let us explain. Please." I hung up. I looked at my husband, this man I'd built a life with, and I asked him one more time, "Are you sleeping with her?" He looked me dead in the eyes and said no. He said they weren't having an affair. He said I had it all wrong. He begged me to listen to him, to let him explain. But I couldn't hear him. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. All I could see was the evidence piling up in front of me, the secret meetings, the deleted messages, the emotional embrace I'd witnessed with my own eyes. I told him to leave. He refused. We fought. We screamed at each other. Things were said that couldn't be taken back. Trust that had taken 7 years to build collapsed in a single afternoon. Jessica showed up at our house an hour later. She was sobbing, begging me to listen. Marcus was pacing like a caged animal, and I was standing in the middle of my living room, watching my entire life implode around me. They both kept insisting they weren't having an affair. They kept telling me I didn't understand. They kept saying it wasn't what it looked like. I didn't believe them. How could I? Everything pointed to betrayal. Everything pointed to the two people I trusted most in the world conspiring behind my back. I thought the betrayal was an affair, but I was wrong. For a week, I lived in a fog of pain and confusion. I stayed with my sister. I ignored Marcus's calls. I blocked Jessica's number. I consulted a divorce lawyer. I cried until I had no tears left. I replayed every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I'd missed, clues I'd ignored. I tortured myself with images of them together, imagining conversations they'd had about me, lies they'd told to cover their tracks. My sister kept telling me to hear them out, but I couldn't. The evidence was too damning. The hurt was too deep. I couldn't imagine any explanation that would make this okay. Then Jessica showed up at my sister's house. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days, like she'd been crying nonstop. She didn't ask to come in. She just stood on the porch and said 4 words that changed everything. Marcus took a loan. I didn't understand at first. I asked her what she was talking about, and then she told me the truth, the whole truth, the truth that was somehow harder to accept than an affair would have been. Marcus had taken a large secret loan 18 months earlier. His business wasn't just having problems, it was failing, completely, catastrophically failing. He'd made a series of bad investments, lost major clients, and found himself drowning in debt, but he hadn't told me. He couldn't tell me because he was too ashamed, too terrified of disappointing me, too convinced that he could fix it on his own if he just worked hard enough, made the right moves, found the right solutions. Jessica had found out by accident 6 months ago. She worked in finance, and she'd seen some documents Marcus had left at our house during one of her visits. When she confronted him, he broke down. He confessed everything: the debts, the failing business, the desperate measures he was taking to keep our heads above water, and he begged her not to tell me. Jessica agreed, but only on one condition: she would help him. She would use her financial expertise to help him restructure his debts, find better terms, create a plan to save what could be saved. That's what the secret meetings were. That's what the late night messages were about. That's why they were always huddled together, looking serious and tense. They were trying to save our financial future without letting me know how bad things had gotten. But there was more, something deeper, something that made the guilt I felt even more crushing. The loan Marcus had taken, the investment that had failed so spectacularly, was for a business opportunity I had insisted on years earlier. I'd been so excited about it, so convinced it was the right move. I'd pushed him to take the risk, to be bold, to think bigger, and he'd done it. For me, to make me happy, to give me the life I dreamed about. When it failed, he couldn't bear to tell me. He couldn't stand the thought of me knowing that my idea, my dream, had nearly destroyed us financially, so he'd carry that burden alone. He'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to fix it. He'd sacrificed his pride, his peace of mind, his health, all to protect me from the consequences of a decision we'd made together. There was no affair, no betrayal of love, just fear, secrecy, and silent sacrifice. Jessica stood on that porch and laid it all out: the numbers, the timeline, the sacrifices Marcus had made, the nights he'd stayed up until 3 in the morning trying to find solutions, the clients he'd begged for extensions, the pride he'd swallowed to ask for help. And she told me something else, something that broke me in a completely different way. Marcus had been planning to tell me everything. He'd been waiting until they had a solid plan in place, until he had some good news to balance the bad news, until he could show me that yes, things were terrible, but he'd found a way forward. He didn't want me to panic. He didn't want me to feel like our world was ending. He wanted to be able to say, "We have a problem, but I've figured out how to solve it." That's what the folder was. The day I saw them on the porch, that was the plan they'd been working on for 6 months. Marcus was finally ready to tell me. Jessica was there for moral support, to help him explain the financial details, to back him up when I inevitably got upset. And then I'd accuse them of having an affair and destroyed everything before he ever got the chance. I couldn't breathe. I literally couldn't breathe. The weight of my mistake, my accusation, my refusal to listen was crushing me. I'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that I knew what was happening, and I'd been completely, devastatingly wrong. Jessica left me with a stack of documents, bank statements, loan agreements, email chains between her and Marcus discussing payment plans and debt consolidation, physical proof of every word she'd said. And at the bottom of the stack was a letter from Marcus addressed to me, dated a week before I'd confronted him. I read that letter sitting on my sister's couch, and I sobbed, really sobbed, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't know it existed. Marcus had written everything down: his fears, his shame, his desperation to fix things before I found out, his gratitude to Jessica for helping him when he felt like he was drowning, his love for me, his terror of losing me. He'd poured his heart onto paper because he knew the conversation was going to be hard, and he wanted to make sure I understood everything he was feeling, everything he'd been going through. The problem was never betrayal of love, it was silence. I went home that night. Marcus was there, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. When he saw me, he didn't say anything. He just waited, like he was preparing himself for the final blow, the moment I'd tell him it was over. Instead, I handed him the letter, and I said I was sorry. I said I should have listened. I said I should have trusted him enough to know that if something was wrong, there had to be an explanation bigger than what I'd assumed. We talked for hours. He showed me everything: every bank statement, every loan document, every desperate email to creditors, the full scope of how bad things had gotten. It was worse than I'd imagined. So much worse. We were on the edge of losing everything: the house, the business, our savings, all of it. But that night, sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by financial ruin, something shifted. For the first time in months, maybe years, we were completely honest with each other. No secrets, no protection, no trying to shield each other from hard truths. Just raw, painful, necessary honesty. The business collapsed anyway. Despite Jessica's help, despite the plan they'd worked so hard on, the damage was too severe. We had to close the firm. Marcus had to take a job working for someone else, making a fraction of what he'd made as a consultant. We had to sell our house and move into a smaller apartment. We had to give up the life we'd built and start over from scratch. The financial crisis became brutally, undeniably real. But the real crisis wasn't the money, it was the distance that had grown between us, the emotional gap that secrecy had created, the trust that had been broken, not by betrayal, but by silence. We went to marriage counseling. I insisted on it. If we were going to survive this, if we were going to rebuild, we had to learn how to communicate, really communicate, not just about the good stuff, but about the hard stuff, the scary stuff, the stuff that made us feel weak or ashamed or terrified. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to leave, when the weight of everything felt like too much, when I looked at Marcus and felt anger instead of love, anger that he'd hidden the truth from me, anger that he thought I couldn't handle it, anger that he'd chosen silence over partnership. But slowly, session by session, conversation by conversation, we started to rebuild not the life we'd had, but something different, something more honest, something built on a foundation of truth instead of protection. I also had to rebuild my friendship with Jessica. That was almost harder than fixing my marriage. I'd accused her of something terrible. I'd looked at her with suspicion and hatred. I'd destroyed 15 years of friendship in a single afternoon because I'd refused to believe that there could be any explanation other than the worst one. Jessica forgave me. She understood why I'd jumped to conclusions. She said if the situation had been reversed, she might have done the same thing. But forgiveness doesn't erase hurt, and it took months before we could be in the same room without the weight of what happened sitting between us like an unwelcome guest. The lowest point came about 6 months after everything fell apart. We were in our tiny apartment, eating ramen for the third night in a row because we were counting every dollar. Marcus was working a job he hated, taking orders from people he used to compete with. I was picking up freelance work wherever I could find it. We were tired, we were stressed, we were struggling in ways we'd never struggled before. And one night, sitting on our second-hand couch, Marcus looked at me and said, "I'm sorry I ruined your life." That's when I realized how much damage the silence had really done. Marcus didn't just feel like he'd failed financially. He felt like he'd failed me. Like he'd taken my dreams and destroyed them. Like he'd turned me into someone living a smaller, harder life than I deserved. I took his face in my hands and I told him the truth. I told him that yes, he'd made mistakes. Yes, he should have told me sooner. Yes, the silence had hurt us in ways I was still trying to understand. But he hadn't ruined my life. He'd been trying to save it. And that counted for something. That counted for a lot. The turning point came when Marcus got a new job offer. Nothing glamorous, but stable, with benefits, with potential for growth. It wasn't his dream, but it was a foundation, something to build on. Around the same time, I landed a contract that would cover 3 months of rent. Small victories, but they felt enormous. We started having honest conversations about everything: money, dreams, fears, the future. We made a rule: no secrets, even if the truth was hard, even if it was embarrassing, even if it felt like it would hurt more than help. We'd rather deal with hard truths together than comforting lies alone. Jessica became part of our financial recovery team. She helped us create a real budget, a real plan, a real path out of the mess we were in. She didn't do it out of obligation. She did it because she loved us, because that's what family does. Slowly, things got better. Not easier, but better. We found a rhythm. We learned to live with less and appreciate what we had. We started dreaming again, smaller dreams maybe, but dreams that felt possible, achievable, real. Marcus started a side consulting business, working evenings and weekends, slowly rebuilding his reputation. I took on more freelance projects. We saved every extra dollar. And 2 years after losing everything, we were able to move into a nicer apartment. Not the house we'd had before, but something we'd earned together, something we'd built with honesty and hard work and partnership. Our marriage became stronger than it had ever been before, not because everything was perfect, but because we'd learned to be imperfect together. We'd learned that trust doesn't mean assuming the best at all times. It means being willing to have hard conversations when assumptions fail. It means choosing honesty over comfort. It means being vulnerable enough to admit when you're scared, when you're failing, when you need help. Jessica is still my best friend. Some days, I think our friendship is stronger now than it was before because we've been through the fire and come out the other side. We've learned that real friendship isn't just about the good times. It's about showing up when things are messy, when accusations fly, when forgiveness feels impossible but necessary. I look back now at that day when I saw Marcus and Jessica on the porch, and I wish I could go back and tell myself to breathe, to wait, to ask questions before jumping to conclusions. But I can't. All I can do is carry the lesson forward. I thought my husband and my best friend were betraying me, but the truth was harder to accept. Sometimes the people you suspect are hurting you are actually trying to protect you. And sometimes silence can damage a relationship more than betrayal ever could. If there's anything I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Don't let your worst assumptions become the truth before you've asked the hard questions. Don't let fear drive you to conclusions that destroy what you've built. And when someone you love is struggling, don't just assume they'll tell you. Create the kind of relationship where they feel safe enough to be honest, even when the truth is ugly, even when it means admitting failure, even when it feels like the end of the world. Because silence is a slow poison. It kills from the inside out. It creates distance where there should be intimacy. It builds walls where there should be bridges. Marcus and I are still together. We're still rebuilding. We're still learning how to be partners in the fullest sense of the word. Our life looks different than we planned, smaller in some ways, bigger in others, but it's ours, built on honesty, built on trust that's been earned through fire. And Jessica is still family, still the person I call when I need to talk, still the person who shows up when things get hard, still my sister in every way that matters. The affair I imagined would have been simpler, in a way. There would have been a clear villain, a clear ending, a clear reason to walk away. But real life is messier than that. Real betrayal isn't always about love or sex. Sometimes it's about fear. Sometimes it's about silence. Sometimes it's about trying so hard to protect someone that you end up hurting them instead. I'm grateful, in a strange way, for what happened because it forced us to rebuild our marriage from the ground up. It forced us to learn how to communicate honestly. It forced us to face the fact that good intentions aren't enough if they lead to devastating silence. My marriage survived, my friendship survived, I survived, but not because everything worked out perfectly, because we chose honesty over comfort, because we chose truth over protection, because we chose to rebuild instead of walking away. And that's the real confession. Not that I suspected an affair, but that I almost destroyed my marriage and my oldest friendship because I was too afraid to ask the right questions, too convinced of my own assumptions, too unwilling to imagine that the truth might be something I never expected. Sometimes the biggest betrayal isn't what other people do to you, it's what you do to yourself when you let fear and assumptions override trust and communication. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it, and that's what matters.
If this part of my story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on your notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter, because the next part of my story is where everything changes.